Good morning, Magic. I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast. And a question I get a lot, and Mark Rosewater gets a lot, and I'm sure other designers get a lot too, is will we ever make the Nephilim Legendary? And, well, I have a lot to say about this whole thing, so how about I kick it off with a story? I remember my first ever Grand Prix, now known as Magic Fest. It was a Grand Prix in my hometown of Seattle in 2005. I remember the format, extended. I remember my deck, Blue-Green Madness, trying to fight the good fight with arrogant worms and aqua amoebas against a field of powerful combo and aggro decks. But there's also one thing I remember, which I had never seen before. Posted all around the venue, on paper signs hastily assembled and printed, were reminders about how the wording on cards had changed. I don't remember all the ones on the sheet, but the big one was around how Cloud of Fairies and the other untapped cards from Urza Saga block worked. They had been changed to only work if you cast them from your hand. This wasn't about how the cards were written at all. I learned this change existed for the first time in the middle of a tournament by reading this paper. This wasn't a clarification. It wasn't working to fix a misprint. It was an intentional change to make them weaker by changing the rules text. This was my first experience with functional errata. Now, functional errata has had a very long history in Magic. Even cards from the very first set, Alpha, have received it at various points in history. For example, Basalt Monolith, for a very long time, had errata saying you couldn't use mana from itself to untap it. As might be clear, using any way to reduce that mana cost, like a power artifact, or for a newer example, Zerta, lets you make infinite mana. Even with just Mesmeric Orb, you can mill your entire library. There's also been some errata done to preserve functionality. For example, the original Howling Mine and Winter Orb said nothing about turning off while untapped, but the newer ones do. Why? Because back in the beginning, a rule of Magic was that artifacts stopped working while tapped. When that rule changed and Howling Mine came back in 6th edition, some high-profile cards gained that text, so they would play the same as they always did. Why Howling Mine, but not, say, Gauntlet of Might, which is from the same set and also would have turned off while it was tapped? Well, it was a judgment call made at the time of the rules change, based on how the cards were used. Things were just different back then. The if untapped versions of Howling Mine, Winter Orb, and Static Orb made it to print and have been printed many times now, so their strange errata became Magic canon. And this highlights the problem with errata. It's very pick and choose, make a judgment call. And when you get into the dangerous world of power level errata, where you start changing cards just because you feel they're too powerful or want to add something missing, it can be a real problem. There's a lot of weird errata in Magic's past. It wasn't always consistent and ranged from things as tiny as Goblin Snowman somehow turning from a triggered win ability to a static if ability, to as large as a pure power level errata like Flash, which was specifically given a change so you couldn't use it to cheat in any creature's dies effect for 2 mana. Over time, we've worked a lot to roll back these changes, so the cards do what they say. Sometimes, like when we fixed the Grievous Heir of Goblin Snowman, nobody remembers or cares. Other times, when we change a card like Flash, it accidentally breaks an entire format, as it did with Flash and Protean Hulk. Phyrexian Dreadnought is now stifleable again, Basalt Monolith can do its power artifact combo, and Cloud of Fairies works even when you cheat it into play. Our incredible editing and rules team looks at all of this stuff very carefully and has really done a lot of great work here. Magic is a very tricky beast to make everything interconnect and make sense. And they somehow take tons of years of cards compounding on one another, many of which are outdated, and make them all work together. It's constantly impressive. Now, there are some weird exceptions to the rollbacks in places where there's still debate around intent, like Waylay, which clearly was not intended to end-step create 3 2/2s that could attack next turn, or cards like Howling Mine, which have been printed with a different wording for so long, or how to handle cards from Portal, a set that didn't have any instants, so there were sorcery speed counterspells. We've made those instants now. There's even one of my personal favorite pieces of trivia, Aeson Crusader. It references heroes, a type which no longer exists. But the 3 original heroes, Benelish Hero, Keldoran Warrior, and Beastwalkers, are all soldiers or warriors. So now, Aeson Crusader counts the number of soldiers and warriors you control. A funny switcheroo, so the card plays as it originally did, even if the text doesn't match at all. But on the whole, after trying a lot of different solutions across nearly 30 years, we have a pretty consistent stance. We don't power level errata cards anymore. And it's for a good reason. It can really trip people up. When we do something like change the rules to allow targeting planeswalkers directly with damage spells, so that you lightning bolt a planeswalker directly instead of targeting a player and redirecting, the mismatch on cards causes no end of questions from newer players about if older cards that read target creature or player can target planeswalkers. And then older players checking how Earthquake works now. That's pretty rough already, but it gets far more problematic when it's not a rule or a mechanic changing across the board, but a change to an individual card for function or power. Imagine walking into an event, whether a Magic Fest or a local store, with a deck and seeing that your cards don't work the way you thought they did. Or worse yet, not knowing that and having someone tell you once you've started to play. Or drafting a current set and being told your creature actually dies in combat because it was errata to lose a toughness. This is the experience we want to avoid. Our cards should do what they say. Now, there are a few exceptions. The main errata we issue are to make cards work as players expect, the opposite of changing a card to make it work in ways that they can't tell by reading the card. For example, to fix errors. When caught and acknowledged right away before the set is even released, we'll change those cards. For example, Oboro Envoy. It's a pretty innocent looking card until you realize that until end of turn was errantly left off of the card. Oops. Not only would that not play properly, but most players don't even notice it until you point it out. That was changed before anyone ever held the card. Another place errata is issued is with creature type updates. This is to line things up, once again, with expectations. For example, Adventures in the Forgotten Realms just came out, and with it, a whole host of types were added. Yisan the Wanderer Bard should be a bard, and Quirion Ranger should be a ranger. It's in the name. These types didn't exist previously, so granting those types makes sense. Usually, this is on a pretty small scale, although I will note that we just did the Phyrexian type update with Vorinclex. Someday, and I'm not saying when, but someday, there'll be more Phyrexians. And when that happens, it made sense to have a type for them. This fairly innocent change has even had impacts in older formats, as Plague Engineer now hits both Glistener Elf and Blighted Agent together. I hope to find places to reprint popular older cards, which are now Phyrexians, so they can get their new type on a printed version. Finally, there is one instance of power level errata I do need to touch on. It's the only one issued in a very, very long time. That, of course, is to last year's companion mechanic. The mechanic came out and ripped through every competitive format, making waves from standard to vintage. Something needed to be done. We talked about a lot of solutions, including banning the cards outright. However, ultimately, we decided to power level errata the mechanic, not the cards, which is an important distinction. The change required 3 generic mana to put them into your hand before casting them. It was an extreme in case of emergency lever, which we pulled on a mechanic that broke a fundamental rule of Magic, and one it took a lot of discussion to decide to pull. It was a small set of cards, all with an identical ability that could be changed in the exact same way. And although I do ultimately think it was the right decision, I will note that in the past year, I have heard from many players being confused about why Companion works differently than it says on the card. And to address that one question to a player, you have to explain events, deck power levels, card strength, and ultimately the changing of the mechanic. Even this carries a significant weight. It is my hope that we never have to do anything like this ever again. As a more enjoyable aside, I'll also note that digital gives us a space where it's fun to play around with this, because there we can always make the cards say what they do. Recently, there was an event called Mirror Mirror on Magic the Gathering Arena, which let players play historic with tweaked versions of cards. A much more fair Oko, a legendary Field of the Dead, and a 5-mana Fires of Invention, for example. I think this is a fun space for Arena to try, and wouldn't be surprised to see more of it in the future. All right, so finally back to the Nephilim. I am asked all the time, why can't we just make these legendary? Yes, it's functional errata, but what great harm is caused to Magic by doing this? And the answer is directly, very little. There would be some places where people play the Nephilim as commanders, their opponents say, hey, that's not legendary, and they explain the situation. Life goes on. It's a little strange, and it adds to the burden of functional errata, but not untenable. But the bigger problem, in my eyes, is the impact in the greater world of Magic. We have done so much work to tamp down on functional errata. The moment we start handing out legendary status to the Nephilim, suddenly that calls into question every other creature ever printed. It's important to be consistent, after all. I would expect we would, like a creature type update, go sweep all creatures. Should Taminoa be made legendary? Should Dark Confidant be legendary? Maybe we should pick some old planeswalkers that seem okay and decide to give them Can Be Your Commander text. And you know what? Chulane came out of the Brawl pre-constructed decks and was way stronger than we would have liked. Let's just demote it to non-legendary. And can we change other card mechanics while we're at it? Suddenly, it's back to the old world of pick and choose judgment calls, where you need to check not your cards, but Oracle text, where you can never be certain if something is okay, where you sit down at a table and suddenly your opponent's commanders are Coiling Oracle, Jace Beleren, and Lightning Bolt. Once you break that trust with the player, once they understand that you always have to go look up your cards, the face of the game changes forever. It's never just 5 cards. If you give a Nephilim a cookie, suddenly the entire fabric of the Magic universe is drawn into question. And to me, that is what is dangerous to open up here. If we were doing them today, yes, they would be legendary, of course. But opening that can of worms, which our editing, rules, and design team have all worked so hard to slowly set right and protect over many years, that's where the danger is. And while we do live in a different world today than when I was at that Grand Prix back in 2005, with information at our fingertips and on our smartphones, it still requires you knowing that you need to go look for it in the first place. It still means you need to check over all of your cards to be sure. And none of that is a great experience. And also, look, I'll even admit, and I say this as a Nephilim fan who has them in some of my decks, the Nephilim are just not worth opening up this can of worms for. So, would I expect to see the Nephilim changed? No, I wouldn't. But the beauty of Commander is that anything goes if your playgroup is okay with it. And if you sit down with your Glint Eye Nephilim deck, I'm not going to say no. And I imagine many players will have the same reaction. Go for it. If your commander is Lightning Bolt though, we're gonna need to have a talk. So now that you've heard all of that, what do you think about this? Are you happy with our current level of errata? Do you think we could handle more? And what should we do with those Nephilim anyway? Let me know in the comments down below. I'll talk with you again on Wednesday. And in the meantime, may you play your cards as written. You got this.
Let's talk about Fallen Empires. Which card? Let's talk about this card, which is a pretty well-known Fallen Empires card. Right here. Ah, yes, Hymn to Turok. That's right.